Welcome to the Closet Calvinist Podcast. Some Christians have an inner Calvinist in them and don't even realize it. We will try to bring out the inner Calvinist that may be in you out of the closet. Here is your host, Mike G.
Welcome back to the Closet Calvinist Podcast. This is episode 16. Now, in this episode, we continue our 5-point series on the 5 points of Calvinism, commonly summarized by the acronym TULIP. In our last episode, we looked at T for total depravity, and we saw from Scripture that sin affects every part of the human person, leaving us spiritually dead and unable to come to Christ apart from grace. Now, in this episode, we move naturally to the next point, which is U for unconditional election. This doctrine answers a crucial question. If sinners cannot save themselves, how does God save anyone at all? Before we define it biblically, let's clear away some common misunderstandings. Unconditional election does not mean God chooses people randomly or arbitrarily. God forces salvation on unwilling sinners, or God looks down the corridors of time to see all who will choose him. Instead, Scripture presents election as purposeful, gracious, and rooted entirely in God's will. Unconditional election teaches that God chose before the foundation of the world to save specific sinners, not based on anything in them, but according to his own gracious purpose. Paul states this plainly in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. He chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him. In love, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will. Notice what is absent. No mention of foreseen faith. No mention of human merit. No mention of conditions met by us. The basis of election is God's will. Election is not based on foreseen faith. One of the most common objections is this: God chooses people because he knows who will believe. But Scripture explicitly rejects that idea. In Romans chapter 9, verses 11 through 13, Paul writes about Jacob and Esau. Though they were not yet born and had nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. She was told, the older will serve the younger. Paul anticipates the objection and answers it directly. Election is before birth, before action, before faith, based on God's call. Paul drives his point home in Romans chapter 9, verses 15 and 16. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. This sentence leaves no room for conditions. Election does not depend on human will or human effort or human decision. It depends entirely on God's mercy alone. This doctrine is not unique to Paul. Jesus himself teaches it. In John chapter 6, verse 37, Jesus says, all that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never cast out. Notice the order. The Father gives, then the sinner comes. And in John 6, verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Election explains why anyone comes at all. Some worry that election removes human responsibility. Scripture never makes that conclusion. Jesus says in John chapter 5, verse 40, you refuse to come to me that you may have life. People are responsible for their unbelief. At the same time, Scripture teaches that belief itself is a gift. Paul says in Philippians chapter 1, verse 29, it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him. Faith is granted. That is election applied in time. Paul explains beautifully in Romans chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Grace and conditions are mutually exclusive. If election were based on foreseen faith, grace would no longer be grace. Far from creating arrogance, election destroys boasting. Paul asks in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, "What did you have that you did not receive?" If salvation begins with God's choice, then gratitude replaces pride, and worship replaces self-confidence. Unconditional election is deeply pastoral. If salvation began with your decision, it could end with your failure. But if salvation began with God's purpose, it will end in glory. Paul assures us in Romans chapter 8, verse 30, "Those whom he predestined he also called, and those whom he called he also justified, and those whom he justified he also glorified." There are no dropouts in God's plan. You are not saved because you were smarter, quicker, or more spiritual than others. You are saved because God was merciful. As Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 7 and 8 reminds us, it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you, but it is because the Lord loves you. That is unconditional election. Now the final takeaway. Unconditional election teaches that 1. God chose his people freely. 2. His choice was not based on foreseen faith or works. 3. Salvation rests on mercy, not merit. And 4. Grace is truly grace. This doctrine humbles the sinner, magnifies God's mercy, and gives unshakable assurance. And it prepares us for the next truth in this series, which is L, limited or definite atonement. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Closet Calvinist Podcast. May God richly bless your life. Grace and peace to you.
Thank you for listening to the Closet Calvinist Podcast. If you have any questions, then please contact us at our email, mikeg@theclosetcalvinist.com, or visit our website at www.theclosetcalvinist.com.